We're going to take a look at the sensory nervous system in Chapter 10. So where we are in the nervous system is we're out in the peripheral nervous system, and we're going to be looking at the afferent or sensory division. So that's where we are. And in this picture here, notice we're out in the peripheral nervous system, so we're outside the brain and spinal cord. And we're going to be bringing in information about the environment and also about what's going on inside the body through our afferent or sensory neurons to the sensory nervous system. And remember, the brain and spinal cord is our integrating center, and then they'll decide what to do about the sensory information, make a decision, and if something needs to be done, they'll send some motor signals out through the efferent division to either the somatic motor neurons to skeletal muscle or through the autonomic motor neurons to the cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. When we talk about the sensory nervous system, there's just a couple of vocabulary words to go over first. The word sensation is just talking about when the nerve signal makes it to the cerebral cortex in your brain, then you become aware of these sensations. So for example, you're poking the cactus spine with your index finger, and sensation would be that you're aware of the pain in your index finger. So that would be sensation. Perception is that you're going to interpret the meaning of these sensations. So you would put things together like you see the cactus, you feel the pain in your index finger, and you would put things together and say, oh, well, the reason my finger hurts is because I'm poking the cactus. So that would be perception. What's interesting about perception is that different people can perceive different things about the same thing. And then also your perception can be tricked. So the brain can be tricked by things. So let's take a look at some of these things here. So this first picture, you probably see a square here, don't you? But is there really a square? There's not, is there? But your brain perceives that there's a square, and your brain has filled in that there are some lines here, but there really are no lines there, are there? Okay, so your brain's perception has been deceived. And this next picture in the middle here, if you look at this and you look at the square, your brain perceives that the sides of the square are kind of curved, right? They're not straight, are they? But if you look closely, the lines of the square are actually straight, aren't they? But your brain perceives that they're curved because you're looking at these other circles, and your brain thinks, well, the lines of the squares, must be curved as well. And so your brain perceives that those lines are curved. All right, and then this last picture over here on the right, what animal do you see? So some of you might see a duck, and some of you might see a rabbit. So different people have different perceptions of the same picture. So it just depends on the person, what you perceive this animal to be. Okay, so that's interesting too. All right, so we have some different types of senses. We have somatic senses. The word soma, remember, means body, and we divide the somatic senses into two types. We have somaesthetic senses. Somaesthetic senses are coming from the surface of your body. So these are things coming from your skin. So this would be like touch. They could be pain or temperature, like you're touching something hot or something cold. Proprioception, that's telling you the position of your limbs. So for example, is your arm straight? Is your leg bent? Okay, that would be proprioception. Your visceral senses, viscera are your internal organs. Some examples of visceral senses might be like your stomach's full or your bladder feels full. Other examples of visceral senses might be, your blood pH or your oxygen level, blood pressure. Okay, those would all be visceral senses. Okay, special senses are all found on your head, and these include things like vision, your sense of smell, taste, hearing, and then also your sense of balance or equilibrium. Okay, so those are all of your special senses. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to the special senses in this chapter, but if you want to read about them, they're actually really fascinating. But unfortunately, we don't have time to cover them. So sensory receptors are going to detect a specific form of energy. Some receptors are going to detect light energy, some will detect sound waves, others detect pressure, so for example, like in touch, and then others detect temperature, and then some will detect chemicals. And then just the vocabulary word for stimulus type that sensory receptors will detect, they call that the modality. And then the law of specific nerve energies. That just says that for a particular receptor, it's going to be specific for a certain energy form or stimulus type that it detects. And then the adequate stimulus is just the stimulus for which a receptor is going to respond to best. So for example, if we look in your eye, in the retina at the back here, we've got the photoreceptors, the rods and the cones. And the adequate stimulus for the photoreceptors, the stimulus to which they're going to respond to best, is going to be light energy. So for the law of specific nerve energies, for photoreceptors, they're going to be responding to light energy, is what they're going to be picking up and responding to the best. These are the different types of sensory receptors. So make sure you know these. We have photoreceptors. They're going to be detecting light, and obviously they're going to be involved in vision. Chemoreceptors, if you look at the name, they're going to be detecting chemicals. So chemoreceptors are going to be involved in the senses that are going to be involved in detecting chemicals. So that would be taste and smell. And then the other one that you may not have thought of would actually be pain. So some of our pain sensory receptors will actually detect the chemicals that are released during inflammation and then send signals up to the brain that will be interpreted as pain. Thermoreceptors, thermo talking about temperature. These thermoreceptors are going to be located on the skin, and so they're going to tell you like if you're touching something warm or something cold, and so they're going to respond to changes in temperature on the skin. And then mechanoreceptors, they're going to be involved in a couple different things. One, most obviously, would be touch. So they're going to be responding to changes in pressure. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But also some things that involve changes in pressure would be sound, with sound waves. And then also balance and equilibrium, which we're unfortunately not going to have time to talk about. There's some fluid waves that will cause some changes in pressure as well in the ear, and that will help give you your sense of balance and equilibrium and whether you're upside down, upright, and so mechanoreceptors are involved in that too. And then another one, nociceptors. Nociceptors are involved in detecting pain as well. So that would be a good one to know too. All right, structural types of sensory receptors. We have 3 different types. There are free nerve endings. So the sensory neuron here, there is nothing surrounding the dendrites, and they will just detect whatever the sensory stimulus is. Okay, and so we'll look at some of the things that are detected by free nerve endings. We'll look at that with some of our touch and pain. And then some of our sensory receptors are going to be encapsulated. So the sensory nerve ending will have a capsule around the dendrites, and we see that especially in touch. And so this capsule gets pushed on, and then that will push on the dendrites, and then that will start the nerve signal. And then the third type of sensory receptor, we actually have a specialized receptor cell that is before the sensory neuron, and the specialized receptor cell will detect the sensory stimulus. So here we've got a photoreceptor, a rod in your eye, that will detect the light energy and then send a signal to the sensory neuron and then send that signal up to the brain. Okay, and then just to kind of test your knowledge here, which structural type of sensory receptor are these? So the picture on the left, what do you think this type of sensory receptor is? So if you take a look at the ending here, you see that there's a capsule surrounding the end of the sensory neuron. So this one will be an encapsulated sensory nerve ending. And so this one would actually be involved in touch. And then what about this one over here? What kind of sensory receptor would this one be? So this one, we've got a specialized receptor cell that's going to detect the stimulus and then send a signal to the sensory neuron, which will then send the signal up to the central nervous system. These specialized sensory receptor cells a lot of times will secrete some neurotransmitters, and that gets picked up by the sensory neuron. And here's an example of a taste receptor in your mouth. They have these specialized receptor cells that are before these sensory neurons. So these specialized receptor cells are sticking out of your taste buds, and they will detect the chemicals in the food that you're eating, and they will secrete some neurotransmitters. Those will bind to the sensory neuron and then send that nerve signal up towards the brain.